So we've entitled this Putin's War, Understanding the Invasion of Ukraine. And I want to make clear that I don't believe this is a war between Russia and the Ukraine, although that's the way it's often portrayed in the media. Um, Russia doesn't, a lot of people in Russia don't even know about the war. A lot of people don't support it. It's purely Putin driving the whole thing, and that's why I've named it Putin's War. Just to start with, let's just get a picture of Ukraine. In the east, it's very Russian oriented, mostly Russian speaking, mostly Russian Orthodox Church. And it has much of Ukraine's ore based resources and manufacturing. In the west, it's very Europe oriented. Much of the west was part of Poland and or Austria-Hungary until 1939. It's very agricultural based and Ukrainian speaking. In the central, at times more Russian oriented, at times more Europe oriented, agriculture and manufacturing. Most of the hydro energy is in the center, and both Ukrainian and Russian is spoken there. Ukraine itself is an incredibly rich country, rich in resources. I'm just going to list the 20 or 25 things that they are in the top 10 in the world. Titanium ore, manganese, iron ore, shale gas reserves, coal reserves, black soil, that really rich black soil of the steppes. That is the best soil in the world for growing things. Sunflowers and sunflower oil, barley, corn, potatoes, rye, bee production, wheat exports, chicken eggs, natural gas pipelines, nuclear power plants, locators and locating equipment, exporter of turbines for nuclear power plants, rocket launchers, clay exports or concentrate exports, export of defense industry products, and steel production. Now, there's another list about that long, of which they are the top 10 in Europe. Ukraine has been continuously occupied since caveman days, 45,000 years ago. Ukraine is blessed by sweeping fields of rich, nutritious soil and forest, nourished by abundant large rivers. Fields and rivers and seaports on the Black Sea have been coveted by foreigners for thousands of years. The first horse was likely domesticated in Ukraine, and it is most likely the place of origin of the Proto-Indo-European language family, of which English is one, as well as probably the first use of a wheeled cart. During the Iron Age, Dacians, Cimmerians, Scythians, Sarmatians inhabited Ukraine in one wave of migration after the other. The Greeks colonized much of the Black Sea coast from 500 BCE, and their sites passed on to the Romans and then to the Byzantines until about 600 CE. The Goths came to Ukraine in the 3rd century, followed by the Huns at the end of the 4th century, Bulgars in the 7th century, Khazars in the 8th, and then the Slavs spread and grew in size from the 5th century and covered most of Ukraine by the end of the 6th century, except eastern Ukraine, which was also home to a lot of Iranians. And eastern Ukraine does have a Muslim population, about 15%. Kiev had emerged as the principal city by 800 CE, conveniently located on the Dnipro River, which provided a navigable waterway from the Baltic Sea and what is now Western Russia, all the way to the Black Sea. Kiev is considered by some to be the birthplace of the Russian nation. Kievan Rus was what the nation was originally called, and Rus, or as we say, Russia, was actually red, denoting the reddish hair of the Swedes who controlled that whole area and established Kiev from the 9th to the 11th centuries. The Mongols invaded in 1239. and controlled Ukraine until Poland and Lithuania drove the Mongols out in the 14th century. Western Ukraine became part of Poland and Lithuania, while Eastern Ukraine was controlled by various tribal groups: Poles, Germans, Lithuanians, and Jews, all migrated to Western Ukraine. Genoa established trading cities on the coast of the Tatar-controlled Crimea from 1470. I went to Ukraine for dental treatment in June 2013 and saved enough on the treatments to pay for several weeks visiting both Western Ukraine and the Russian-speaking part. I made friends with people from both parts, or should I say both sides, as Ukraine has been fractured into the two opposing sides, the Western-oriented West and Europe-oriented West and the Russia-oriented East. Ukrainian speakers in the West and the Russian speakers in the East is a further division. These represent significant differences in the histories of the West and the East sides of Ukraine, quite separate histories. Kiev is considered the birthplace of Russia, but is more aligned with the western part of Ukraine, which was part of Poland and Austria until given to the Soviet Union in the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War to punish the Austrians for starting World War I. The eastern third of Ukraine plus Crimea has always been Russian-speaking with a Russian culture and an economy integrated with Russia. The very far west, Lviv and Lutsk and the other cities near the Polish border were actually part of Poland until 1939, when Hitler and Stalin divided Poland in half. And at that stage, half of of that part of Ukraine became part of the half that Russia ended up with. In the 30s, Stalin, desperately needing food for his Russian supporters after the failures in production caused by his collectivization of Russian agriculture, took all the food from Western Ukraine to Russia, leaving 6 to 7 million Western Ukrainians to die of starvation. He did the same thing for the same reason after World War II, leaving 2 to 3 million to starve to death. These are very strong reasons why Western Ukrainians, remembering also their ties to Western European culture, resent and even hate the Russians. There's a movie came out on Netflix called Mr. Jones, if you want to pursue this. The movie Mr. Jones talks about a reporter who discovers the famine caused by Russia, which the Russia had tried to cover up. Now, Eastern Ukraine did not suffer the same fate. They were taken care of by the Russians because they had the mines, the metals, the minerals that Russia needed, as well as the factories to process them. So they never had that antagonism towards Russia that the Westerners had from the famines. When NATO expansion occurred after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was not, as a lot of people are saying, it was not as a result of the Western nations pushing into the Eastern zone, into the ex-Russian controlled zone of the Baltics and Slovakia, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. The impetus actually came from the East European countries themselves, particularly Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and initially was supported only by the smaller or less populous NATO countries. The US crafted a thing called the Partnership for Peace in an effort to avoid expanding NATO's military structure. This policy did not satisfy the East European governments, however. Because of their historical experiences, they insisted on full NATO membership. Now, you need to put in your mind, I think, what it was like for the people living in the East European countries under the Soviet Union. They were exploited. They lived in basically police states. They never knew when there would be a secret a service person watching them, and their families. And also, the Soviet Union decided how much food that everyone was to produce, and at what price they were going to buy it from. So, from the Eastern European perspective, they wanted to not be attached to Russia. They wanted to be attached to to the West, um, particularly when they looked at the development of the European market. And they saw subsidies coming from the EU. They saw much higher prices being paid. They saw that they could sell their goods and services, and their food in particular, to the West at much better prices than Russia was paying them. And they could have the freedom that they were able to see on the televisions, that they didn't have under the Soviet Union. Now, there were a lot of advantages to the EU in expanding into the East. Cheaper labor was one of them, access to much more food, access to technology. Um, and that was a benefit to most EU countries. However, there was no benefit to the West of Ukraine and the East joining NATO. It just put the West of Europe, or all of Europe, except Eastern nations, it put them under a duress, under a pressure, um, and under a fear that a Russian invasion, they would all have to join in and fight Russia. And they would rather be out of NATO, have these countries being out of NATO, have these countries be neutral, and act as a military buffer in case of a Russian invasion. So it was to the advantage of the West to have the Eastern nations in the EU, but it was an advantage to keep them out of NATO. And yet they insisted, and they kept putting pressure on the Western governments until the governments finally agreed. Now, I was in Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, earlier this century, when Slovakia became part of NATO. And there was jubilation throughout the city, celebrations throughout the city. They were just so happy to be a part of it. And it's because they had still a fear of Russia, and a fear of the time that they spent as part of the Soviet Union. Now, the United States and with the European Union has been agitating in Ukraine ever since about 1994. And then so has Russia. They've both been agitating for control of governments, control of policies, getting their people that oriented to the West or the East in power there. And in 1994, there was a treaty that was signed between the UK, the US, and Russia to the treaty promised those three countries would secure Ukraine from protection from any invasion from anyone, in exchange for Ukraine shipping their nuclear-guided ICBM missiles back to Russia. Russia wanted to get the missiles into their control. The United States wanted them out of Ukraine as well, because they didn't trust the Ukraine government. And so they signed this treaty. It was called the Budapest Agreement. And that treaty, of course, was broken by Russia when they invaded Crimea in 2014. But legally, Russia is still obliged to protect the Ukraine from outside aggression. as is the UK and the US. And you note that they won't mention this treaty either because they don't want to start a full-scale war with Russia. So, the Russia didn't trust the Ukrainians with the nuclear missiles. The West didn't trust them. So it looked like this agreement. They destroy the nuclear warheads. Well, they'd reprocess the nuclear fuel for power stations, and Ukraine would get the protection they wanted. But Clinton, Bush, and Obama all undermined the treaty from the beginning by funding and training political parties in opposition to the various presidents that were picked by Yeltsin and Putin. Those opposition parties put more and more pressure on the Ukraine governments to develop strong trade ties with the EU, and were almost successful with the trade treaty, supported by many of Ukraine's oligarchs because they wanted to trade with the EU as well. That Ukraine President Yanukovych was due to sign the treaty in late November 2013. Now, Putin, of course, was also undermining the treaty from 1999 as prime minister under Yeltsin and then president. When the Russian Secret Service began to fund and train underground groups who would eventually start the agitation for succession of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. The head of one of those groups is now the appointed chairman of Crimea. So we had very deep historical animosities, underhanded actions from both Western governments and Russia, striving to protect its borders. Russia was striving to protect its borders because they liked the buffer of having Ukraine and Belarus between them and Western Europe. And then atop all that, we had a broken economy in Ukraine that disadvantaged most Ukrainians, and a quite pronounced cultural divide between the East Russian-oriented people and the West European-oriented people. So it was an ideal setup for trouble. Keep in mind that the major strategic goal of Russia since the Churchill-Roosevelt-Stalin conference in Tehran in 1943 was to have a buffer between Russia and Europe. In fact, this goal of a buffer goes back to Peter the Great in the late 1600s. Russia achieved that buffer when Roosevelt gave them all of Eastern Europe. But they lost it when the Soviet Union fell apart. Under his leadership, Putin has gone to great trouble to build up good relationships with Europe, especially trade relationships. And the US seemed to value a better relationship with Russia under Obama and Trump. But underneath the advantages of increased trade and less diplomatic pressures, both the neocons of the US and the Russian autocrats and neocons were still fighting the Cold War. To further set the scene, we must examine the perilous state of the Ukraine economy. Ukraine had always been dependent on Russia for the majority of its trade. Much of the goods sold in the shops came from Russia, as did much of its oil and gas and some of its electricity. Russia was also Ukraine's major export market, especially for food, raw materials, and the manufactured goods built in the factories of East Ukraine: aircraft, armored vehicles, steel, and a wide range of other manufactured goods. But with independence came the oligarchs, just as in Russia. Politically well-connected people, mainly ex-Soviet bosses. They either bought or were given strategic industries at fire sale prices. And like in Russia, the oligarchs controlled the media and the parliament and many of the cities. And like in Russia, the oligarchs ripped off the government with corrupt contracts and political influence. Between 1991 and 2013, 50% of Ukraine's GDP went to just 9 oligarchs. Ex-President Yanukovych is reported to be worth $30 billion. And that is not counting the mansions, the zoo, the exotic car collection, and the gold that he left behind when he fled the country. Whereas in Russia, Putin brought the oligarchs under control by agreeing that they could grow their wealth as long as they supported him. And those that didn't support him were either thrown in jail or murdered. The leaders of Ukraine, frequently oligarchs themselves with media ownership, never could control the oligarchs. So, with the massive gap between the few rich, and the increasing poor, Ukraine's economy spiraled downwards until they had to borrow to keep the economy going. Of course, high debt and a sick economy make a country and its leaders extremely vulnerable. This vulnerability was exactly what Putin exploited when pressure from the West and from Western Ukrainians compelled President Yanukovych to agree to sign a trade agreement with the EU. During 2013, the Ukraine government negotiated this trade agreement. I was there in May and June 2013 and saw no indication or sign of any unrest. Now, observe carefully the timeline of the breakdown. One, Putin puts trade restrictions on Ukraine's exports to Russia and raises gas prices in October, November 2013 to force Ukraine to not sign the trade agreement with the EU. Putin calls Yanukovych to Moscow. On his return, Yanukovych rejects signing the EU agreement. Yanukovych allows the Maidan is the center square of Kiev, allows the Maidan protest to continue. And foreign fools like Senator John McCain come to Kiev to inflame the crowd. Putin calls Yanukovych to Moscow. On his return, Yanukovych institutes repressive laws, similar to what Putin put in place after his last presidential election, which raised a lot of protest. In exchange, Putin agreed to buy 15 billion of Ukraine bonds, about a quarter of what Putin spent on the Olympics. Putin is no fool. He would have known the repressive laws would inflame the protesters. But Yanukovych had no choice. Without the repressive laws Putin wanted, Ukraine would have to pay more for gas and wouldn't get the loans that they desperately needed. Naturally, the laws prohibiting protest and taking away legal rights of citizens did inflame the protesters, and people came from all over Ukraine to join the protest. Yanukovych tries to compromise with the opposition and removes these repressive laws. Putin stops the loans and renews the trade barriers. Putin calls Yanukovych to Sochi. Sochi is the one of the favorite on the Black Sea holiday areas, and the Winter Olympics were there as well. And Putin's palace was built there during the Winter Olympics. So Putin calls Yanukovych to Sochi. On his return, the Berkat interior police snipers are ordered to assassinate protesters and some police. Again, Putin would know this would inflame the protesters and lead to the government being pushed out, which happened, and Yanukovych flees to Kiev. Putin offers Russian passports to all Russian speakers in Ukraine. Russian parliament and upper house vote to allow Putin to invade Ukraine. Not just Crimea, as reported in the media, but the vote was to invade all of Ukraine. And this is back in 2014. Putin labels the Ukraine government as illegal, which it is technically, because the constitutional requirements for replacing a president were not quite met. However, the Ukraine constitution just doesn't contain a response to a situation where a president abandons his post and flees the country. Putin labels the Ukrainian government fascist or Nazi, which is only partly true. as fascists only controlled in 2014, only controlled 10% of parliamentary seats and only had 3 seats in the cabinet. Interestingly enough, after Maidan and after the invasion by Russia in 2014, in the election that followed that elected Pedro Poroshenko as president, only 1.2% voted for far right Nazi oriented parties. So, one conclusion I draw from that is that they were not so much Nazi or neo Nazi parties, they were nationalist parties and um, and got popular because they opposed Russia. Uh, Probably safer to say they opposed Putin. So Putin being saying, he still continues to say that the Russians in Ukraine must be saved from the fascists, the Nazis. And he then invades Crimea, having created the perfect excuse by instigating the breakdown of the Ukraine government and then saying the Ukraine government does no longer exist. We must move in. We must protect Russians speaking people, and we must um, uh, make sure that the Nazis don't get control of the Ukraine. Putin sends soldiers into Ukraine proper to seize control of major gas distribution plants, and um, and then into the Donbass, far eastern area. Now, Putin, in 2014, in the talk I gave to the WEA, I predicted that Putin would have to seize control of all the oil and gas pipelines going into Ukraine, going from Ukraine to Crimea, as well as the water supplies from Ukraine that Crimea depends on. These all go through Ukrainian cities of Kherson and Mariupol. And I made the comment, watch for this in the news. Well, that's what we're seeing right now. Putin holds military this is going back to 2014. Putin holds military exercises along the eastern Ukraine border and in Transnistria. The Russian enclave, which is just it's sandwiched in between Moldova and southern Ukraine. Russian soldiers without insignia on their uniforms have joined the protest group to take over government buildings in major eastern Ukrainian towns, including Kharkiv, Lugansk, Donetsk, and Mariupol. Russian officers take control of police forces in those towns after threatening any police who do not join them with execution. Now, citizens drive the Russian-backed separatists out of Kharkiv and out of Mariupol, but were unsuccessful in driving them out of Lugansk and Donetsk. Fitting these pieces together, it is hard to make any argument other than that Putin organized the downfall of the government through the Maidan protest to create an excuse for invading Crimea and the eastern parts of eastern Ukraine, to get control of East Ukraine's abundant natural resources and manufacturing, as well as to give Russia a buffer zone. President Poroshenko, who was elected just after the invasion in 2014, a Western-leaning oligarch with interest in chocolate and the media, was elected in March 2014. He'd been forced by economic circumstances to ask for financial aid from the IMF twice. Naturally, this aid comes with the typical IMF requirements of selling government assets to Western interests and lowering wages and social spending, thereby driving the majority of the population into worse economic circumstances. Already inflation has surged, and the hryvnia, which is the currency of Ukraine, lost half of its value, making its imported goods from the West super expensive. Goods from Russia had not gone up that much because the ruble had gone down so much since 2014 invasion. But Russia is also in recession, and its economic growth has faltered. even before the Western sanctions came into play. 70% of Russia's exports are oil and gas. And with the plummeting of the oil and gas prices, Russia had to call on its foreign currency reserves to keep the government running and help support the banks. Crimea will cost Russia $5 to $6 billion a year or more if they not take control of the oil, gas, and water that comes from Ukraine. The Russian Finance Ministry in 2014 asked Putin to reduce military spending and feed more cash into the economy. Putin refused. He reduced the budget of all government agencies in Russia except defense, where he increased the budget by 30%. So holding on to parts of Ukraine, even if only eventually Eastern Ukraine, will cost Russia a small fortune. The US and EU in 2014 placed ineffective sanctions on some senior Russian officials, but not on Putin and his inner circle. So they had very little effect. And they allowed Moscow to go ahead with the World Cup, which seemed to Putin to be a reward for his activities. Soviet conditions, as I mentioned before, were so bad for people living in Eastern Europe that when they had the opportunity to break free, they all voted for it. All the countries except Belarus voted to get out of the Russian Confederation or the Soviet Confederation. And they wanted to have more access to the better made Western goods and services rather than the inferior products they were getting from Russia. And they wanted freedoms. They'd read about freedoms, they'd seen it on television, and they experienced firsthand the secret police of these countries, keeping a tight grip on whatever they wanted to say or to do. And the other thing is that they wanted NATO and US soldiers on their land, under the theory that Russia would not risk an invasion of their land if it meant killing American soldiers or NATO soldiers, because then the NATO and the US would be forced to launch a counterattack against Russia. So the idea that, as Putin said, that the East had nothing to fear from Russia had no real substance. There was a lot to fear, and this recent invasion proves it. In 1990, in Malta, there was an agreement between Gorbachev and Clinton that they neither would expand their military presence along the border with Russia, between East Europe and with Russia. This was not signed, and they both have interpreted differently subsequently, and certainly not held to by either side, because for years Russia has been increasing their forces and on their side of the border, and of course NATO has been increasing the forces and support on the Eastern European side. Then we had the 1994 Budapest Agreement, which of course was broken by Russia with the invasions, both in 2014 and this year. In 2008, there was what was called the NATO Expansion Agreement. Ukraine and Georgia had been putting immense pressure on the NATO countries to allow them to join. But the Western countries didn't want either of them to join because they see that as direct confrontation with Putin. And they would rather have both those countries be independent and act as buffer zones. Now, both Ukraine and the US still currently interpret that NATO expansion agreement as an open discussion agreement that could eventually lead to Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. But there's no commitment. In fact, they made sure that everyone was clear that there was no commitment for either of them to join NATO, and it would be a long time in the future before they would feel comfortable. So the claim that Putin makes about the expansion of NATO causing him to invade Ukraine just doesn't stack up. And even just in the last couple of days, President Zelensky of Ukraine has reaffirmed that they have no intention of joining NATO. Um, and in fact, back in 10 years ago, uh, only 20 or 30% of people in Ukraine wanted to join NATO, but it's the government wanted to be in. Um, Now, I think if you were to ask now how many people wanted to join NATO, they'd probably all say yes, because if Ukraine had been part of NATO, there's no way that Putin would have invaded as he has just done. Um, okay, so part of this competition between the two governments we see by looking at the presidents. The first two presidents from 1991, Ukraine independence, were both Russian oriented. Um, and the second president was what's his name, Kovic or something like that. Uh, won the election in 1994, but it is widely established that that was the election had been manipulated by the Russians, and so we had what was called the Orange Revolution, where people came out in the streets again in the Maidan Square area in central Kiev, and um, they clamored for a new election. A new election was held, and a pro-Western president was elected. Um, Now, this was a slap in the face to Putin because he had tried to organize for his Russian stooge, I guess, to get in. Um, and so we had this Western-oriented government from 2005 up until 2010. And then in 2010, Yanukovych runs for president. He was seen to be pro-Russian, but he also he was running on a pro-EU platform, and he was helped by Paul Manafort and his company, who you may recall. Paul Manafort was Donald Trump's campaign manager and was thrown in jail for, I think, cooperating with a foreign country, which was somehow illegal in the United States. Um, but anyway, Yanukovych was pro-EU and was all ready to sign that EU partnership trade agreement when Putin intervened, as I described. 2014, after the invasion of Crimea in the east, Petro Poroshenko was elected. He was very EU oriented. And he signed an economic agreement with the EU in 2014. He promoted the Ukraine language and the Ukraine Orthodox Church, which shortly thereafter broke away from the Russian Orthodox Church. And during his time, he fought Russia in Donbass. But he was an oligarch with many businesses, including chocolate and TV stations. And he actually stopped the offensive to regain eastern Donbass when Putin threatened his chocolate sales to Russia. He's now on trial for tax evasion and corruption. In 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky, an ethnic Russian Jew who played president on a comedy, president of Ukraine on a comedy TV program, was elected. He's very Western oriented, and he ran on a platform of eliminating corruption, but ineffective as president. Uh, he was ineffective as president in the face of the oligarchs. But of course, we now know he's become extremely popular with everyone, uh, except Putin, after Putin's invasion. So Putin clearly lost the political and economic battle with the West over Ukraine that he'd been waging for 20 years. And so the only hope for him came from invasion. Now, Putin has argued that Ukraine is run by Nazis, and so Russia needs to protect Ukraine from the Nazis. Now, while it is true there are far right elements in Ukraine, as there are in most European countries, and some of these have obvious neo Nazi policies, these parties and movements are small compared to other elements in society. As I said, only 1.2% got elected in the 2014 parliamentary election. Also, like in other European nations, far right parties attract racists as well as staunch nationalists. Included in this second group would be the large percentage of Ukrainians that see nationalization as a bulwark against Russia and against Russian influence. The polls show a big swing towards anti-Russian attitudes since Russian invasion of Crimea and takeover of much of eastern Donbass. Before the invasion, 24% of Ukrainians saw themselves as being ethnic Russians. After the invasion, a couple of years ago, when they did the poll again, only 6%. So there was a massive swing, which I think I'll cover again in a few minutes. The Sloboda Party, which was the right-wing ultranationalist party, which is described by Putin as Nazi. They had 10.45% of the vote in 2012, but lost all but one seat in the 2014 election, as the major parties took on a more anti-Russian positions, which allowed people who were anti-Russian to vote for the major parties. And at the moment, there's only one far-right parliamentarian in parliament. Putin often mentions the Azov Battalion, which is the volunteer militia, and it does have neo-Nazi rhetoric. And since 2014, it has been in the forefront of fighting Russia on the Donbass, Ukraine Donbass line, which is still, well, is now being fought over a lot more, but it had been continually contested by both sides. But it was absorbed into Ukraine's National Guard in 2014 when the government wanted their help in fighting the separatists in the east. Now, they are very anti-Russian and they're very ultra-nationalistic. They're often quoted by pro-Putin factions as proving Ukraine is run by Nazis. But it's still a small force, and it's not influential in the politics of Ukraine. Ukraine is not run by Nazis. It has been run and is still run by oligarchs who gained control, as in Russia, of major industries during the West-sponsored neoliberal economic reforms. I use the term reforms loosely. That were part of the early days of independence. Speaking now of the Russian economy, Russia suffered the same problem as Ukraine when in the early 1990s, and on advice from Western governments, Western corporations, and Western universities, neoliberal reforms, I use the term loosely, led to privatizations, which resulted in mainly ex-Soviet officials and Putin supporters getting control of most of the major sources of Russia's vast wealth. Instead of this wealth being shared around the country, leading to economic growth, the sequestering of most of the wealth into a few pockets meant Russia was always on the verge of recession. When a dictator mismanages an economy, they must find an external enemy. In this case, NATO, Nazis, and Ukraine's disloyalty. 43% of the Russian government income comes from royalties on oil and gas. One analysis I read shows that the cost of finding, drilling, and pumping Russian oil is so expensive that they require an oil price of $120 a barrel to be profitable. The price of oil went from around $65 a barrel to over $100 a barrel on the fear and then the actuality of a Russian invasion. So some could argue that one of the purposes of the invasion was to get the price of oil up because the government depended so much on the royalties from oil and gas that they earned. Looking at Putin's background, he was a KGB agent, at one stage in charge of operations in the area of East Germany. After the breakdown of the Soviet Union, he and some KGB friends built an operation in St. Petersburg, backed by emerging oligarchs and Russian mafia, eventually leading to Putin being appointed a deputy mayor. Then, after moving to Moscow, he was appointed head of the FSB, which is the successor to the KGB. Then appointed prime minister in the dying days of the Yeltsin presidency. He was acting president during the elections in 1990 when he was elected president for the first time. One of his first steps as president was a compact between Putin and Metropolitan Kirill, head of the Russian Orthodox Church, to support each other. And we see this now. Eastern Donbass is still Russian Orthodox, whereas the rest of Ukraine has changed to Ukrainian Orthodox as a breakaway from that. And the Eastern Orthodox priests in Donbass area are still preaching that Russia's crusade in Ukraine, this current invasion, is good and should be supported. Anyway, over the next 5 years, he consolidated his position by killing or jailing the opposition figures, including oligarchs who are not 100% loyal to him. By some estimates, he's the richest person in the world, although nothing of great value is recorded in his own name. Many commentators say Putin has taken the loss of the Soviet republics personally. If this is true, then there is this reason, as well as wanting a strategic buffer zone between Russia and the West, for Putin's efforts to return Ukraine into their fold. Throughout the presidencies, Putin's Achilles heel has always been the poor performance of the Russian economy. To keep control, he's had to instigate ever stricter and harsher control over the media, combined with eliminating his critics. And like many autocrats in history, Putin has increasingly distanced himself from advisors and those who are not yes men. There is increasing concern he's losing touch with reality, thus following similar dissolutions we saw during Hitler's later years. In the last year alone, he has dismissed over 1,000 people in his administration over fears that they could be ripe for a palace coup. He shares this fear with Stalin. For 23 years, since becoming prime minister in 1999, Putin has tried to manipulate Ukraine's elections, governments, and oligarchs into a close alliance with Russia and a disalliance with the West. While most Ukrainians have wanted and voted for the opposite. So I think it's fair to say Putin has lost his battle for Ukrainian hearts and minds, so now sees no other option than invasion. At this stage, it looks like Putin made two major miscalculations. One, that his armed forces were stronger and more committed than they turned out to be. Two, that a large percentage of Ukrainians would favor a closer alliance with Russia and welcome him in. Instead, he is not winning on the battlefield and is making himself public enemy number one in the eyes of most Ukrainians with his slaughter of civilians. The great theorist on the art of war, Sun Tzu, said, "You should always build your enemies a golden bridge." In other words, a way to gracefully retreat. Unfortunately, neither the West nor Putin see a logical way for him to withdraw himself from the mess he's got himself into. So instead, he's adopted the tactic that worked for him in the past: the total destruction of civilian infrastructure, starting with hospitals, schools, homes, electricity, food, and water. It worked in Grozny, in Chechnya, which he totally wiped off the map. It worked in Aleppo, where he virtually totally wiped that city off the map. Kill, starve, freeze, and drive out the citizens to the point that the invaded country or city begs for mercy. Instead, in this case, it's just making the citizens of Ukraine and much of the rest of the world madder and more committed. Putin gave three reasons for the invasion. One was stopping the expansion of NATO. Two, stopping the spread of Nazism. And three, protecting ethnic Russians. Well, the expansion of NATO had already stopped. The West had absolutely no enthusiasm for Ukraine or Georgia to join NATO. Putin has always said that Eastern Europe had nothing to fear from Russia, so why did they need NATO? But this war proves that all of their fears were amply justified. Nazism in Ukraine is not a problem, at least any more than it is a problem in most European nations. In Ukraine, as in France, the far right is more a nationalistic movement than a neo-Nazi movement. This means the far right has become a focus of anti-Russian sentiment, of those demanding sovereignty for Ukraine. Thus, Putin made anti-Nazism a major part of his propaganda. Because these elements in Ukraine are so demonstrably anti-Russian. The idea of Putin protecting ethnic Russians in Ukraine has become a farce as well, as those areas of eastern Ukraine, like Kharkiv and Mariupol, have suffered the worst of the Russian civilian bombing and starvation campaigns. Predicting the outcome at this stage is virtually impossible. A week ago, I was sure that Russian forces would overwhelm Ukrainian forces. Now I'm not at all sure about that. Russia is having unanticipated problems on the battlefield and at home, with over 15,000 anti-war protesters already arrested. Within the next week or so, many of the anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons will arrive from NATO countries, and the sanctions will begin causing economic hardship for Russian citizens. However, expecting Putin to withdraw Russian troops from Ukraine is a hope too far. He's backed himself into a corner, and his massive ego won't let him back down. There is the hope that Putin will be overthrown, but probably it's a very slim hope, as he has so much control over the oligarchs, the church, and the secret services. My guess is that it might come from the army, who are very embarrassed by their lack of success. But could they achieve any success in an overthrow without getting the oligarchs on side? We can only hope that the killing and starvation of civilians will stop, and that the worldwide economic effects of the sanctions will be moderate. But there's no promise in that. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you so much, Charles. Have you got some time if we have some questions?
I'm happy to take any questions. Did anyone write in?
There's one about just asking about the Russian Trump, or the Putin-Trump relationship, where you think that sits in this picture.
That's an interesting one. I personally will go so far as to say that Trump was working for Putin. And I think there's a lot of evidence to back that up. not only were so many of the meetings held in secret and the notes destroyed by Trump afterwards, um, but if you look at some of the things that Trump did that were uh, uh, so part of Putin's campaign. For instance, he tried to destabilize NATO by arguing that U.S. should be withdrawing money from NATO, um, uh, and he was anti-NATO all the way through. Um, the racism in the United States was this perfect example of which he encouraged was a perfect example of Putin's destabilization programs that he used in a lot of countries uh, under the theory that if you can't beat a country militarily, you can destabilize it, and their weakness will then give you more power. The immigration crisis had the same destabilization, and there's just a whole long list of things. The United States, Trump um, uh, removed the United States from a treaty with Russia on short-range ballistic missiles. Um, and this occurred when Russia developed, as you're now reading in the news, the hypersonic missile, which could be fired from a big distance and away from the border. And the treaty was that only very short-range, low-power missiles could be placed within a certain uh, hundreds of kilometers of the border. Um, and once he had that um, hypersonic missile developed, he was basically breaking the treaty. So he got Trump to withdraw, so it didn't look like Russia was withdrawing. So maybe there's a whole nother talk in this, and if I gather enough evidence, but it certainly seemed to me like Trump was the best friend that Putin had.
Cool. We've got lots of really great questions coming through,
Okay.
and lots of thanks as well for your thoughtful analysis.
Thank you.
A couple of people are asking around what can you see an out for Putin, and sort of tied in with that, are there possible solutions? What do you think?
I really struggle to see an out.
Mm.
He's backed himself into a corner. He's got a massive ego. And practically, there's nothing other than withdrawal of forces that gets us back to an independent Ukraine. So negotiations that have been going on have been absolutely no movement in them whatsoever. That both Ukraine and Russia are still sticking to their full demands, and this is a really pessimistic thing to say, but how does someone like Putin get out of a mess like this? And how does the West help and encourage him to get out of this situation without making him mad or madder?
The next one on the list is, how can the oligarchs be controlled or restrained?
Ooh, this points to a much bigger problem right around the world. You know, I made quite a big thing about the oligarchs having all in both Ukraine and in Russia, having all the money and the proceeds, um, and preventing their economies from working in a fair and reasonable manner. But we'd have to say that Western corporations are doing exactly the same thing with their influence on governments, um, and we know how the rich poor gap has expanded at such a tremendous rate in the last 10 or 15 years. Um, Uh, the the only suggestion I've seen that makes sense, but it'd be a lot of trouble, and that is to finally um, require um, registers of ownership of things down to the actual owner rather than the different shadow companies that we currently use. And what that would basically mean is that um, uh, the all the tax evasion that is happening at the moment by the richer people, richer corporations, and so on, would become impossible because everyone would know exactly who owns what and how rich they were, and whether they were paying their taxes or commensurate with their riches, and so on. Um, and the commentator that described this that I was reading just in the last day or so said that the Western world would never allow this to happen because so much of the Western world is controlled by rich industries um, who want to continue to be able to evade taxes and hide ownership and so on. So maybe the one way of getting uh, well, not getting rid of necessarily, but reducing the impact on the oligarchs would be this register. But the Western world would probably not ever allow it.
The next question on here is, where did Ukraine get it wrong, but Finland get it right?
What an intelligent question. I think it, now I'm not an expert on this, but um, on my reflection would be that Finland never had the differences in the ethnic population, or never really had large movements opposing the development of the Finnish society and Finnish economy. There seemed to be a much more agreement. And we see this in other Scandinavian countries too, where um, there's it's more of a working together type of environment, politically and socially. Ukraine has had these divisions, and their history makes it difficult for them to overcome these divisions. Um, when you have part of the Ukraine uh, being always controlled by and part of Russia, part of it being part of the West, Poland, Lithuania for a long time, Austro-Hungarian Empire for a short time, um, and then because it's in a buffer zone area, and when you look on the map, it's quite unique the way it sticks into Russia and sticks into Europe. Um, and there was always going to be pressure from both the West and from Russia to have control of that area politically, if at all possibly, and economically as well. Finland never had that. They had the war with Russia and 1939-40. Uh, they were defeated, but luckily Germany invaded Russia, and the Russians lost interest in controlling Finland. They put all the troops back, and Finland is basically being its own sovereign country ever since. Um, and there hasn't been much of reason for either the Russia or the West to agitate to Finland. They're both quite happy for it to be a neutral nation, talking to everyone. And Ukraine could never do that. It could never be in that position just because of its history.
And do you think what Putin's doing can be seen as ethnic cleansing?
Yes. Um, I have to qualify that. because generally with ethnic cleansing, we think of um, a power of some kind cleansing a certain ethnic group for one reason or another, race, religion, or whatever. Um, his bombing of civilians is indiscriminate, and he's particularly when you look at countries, cities like Kharkiv and Sumy and Mariupol, who have a very, very strong ethnic Russian populations, and he's bombing them more than he is um, Kiev, even, and um, so there's cleansing going on. But how ethnic it is, I don't think our normal definition fits.
If the port cities all fall to Russian control, what would it mean for Ukraine?
Good question. They have effectively fallen to Russian control. So um, the it's a sideline, but um, Russia built the railway system in Ukraine as they did in Spain back in the 30s. And Russia uses a narrower gauge track. So every train going in or out of Ukraine, the goods have to be switched from one uh, box car or flat car or whatever to another because there's no compatibility. So, and that's been that way um, for, well, at least since railroads were first being built in Europe. So that meant that Ukraine had much, much more. And the ports in Ukraine had much, much more importance than they would in a situation where the trains could flow back and forth quite easily. So they got control of Mariupol port, um, and Melitopol and Kherson. They're fighting now to try to get Nikolaev. And then after that, and of course, they've already had the Sevastopol port. After that, the only port left of any significance is Odessa. And if you look at the way the army is moving around Nikolaev, it looks like their next swing is going to be to Odessa. So, but even before they get control of the Odessa port, they've actually blockaded the whole of the northern Black Sea with their warships. So Ukraine is going to suffer dramatically from not being able to import the foods and goods and services that they're used to, but more so probably they're not going to be able to export because almost all the exports went through the ports. Now that has a ramification too, because 30% of the wheat that the world buys comes from Russia and Ukraine. And there's a lot of countries, particularly in the Middle East and in Africa, that rely on Ukrainian grain and sunflower oil and stuff. And where that's going to be replaced, how are they going to get it? Where's it going to come from? Sure, Russia might be able to up their exports a little bit, but it would be tragic closing the ports. And like I say, it's already basically happened.
What part could or do you think China will play?
This is, I guess, has got everyone guessing. And some interesting statistics. The trade with the EU and China is $850 billion a year. The trade between the US and China is $750 billion per year. The trade between Russia and China is $150 billion a year. China's economy in the last 40 or 50 years has been built on trade. So if they were to take a strong role in supporting Russia, they would invite sanctions, and I think that's what Biden and Boris Johnson have made quite clear, that they will invite sanctions which will harm their economy and their trade. Um, and supporting Russia just it's not enough to keep China going. So I think that they'll be focusing on trade more than anything else. And I think the decision whether to lend them troops or anything like that, they're going to try to keep that on the back burner as long as they can. Try not to make a decision and hope that some things are resolved between Ukraine and Russia, or between the West and Russia, so that they won't have to step in. Because if they do, they're in trouble, and everyone else is in trouble too, including New Zealand.
Some would say that Putin is unhinged. Would he create an atmosphere to incite a nuclear exchange by attacking NATO states?
That is a great fear.
Mm.
The psychiatrists I've been reading for the last couple of years have been saying that if that psychologically he is unhinged, that he's showing signs of madness and of aggressiveness and so on. And in that kind of a mood, I guess, people make stupid and harmful decisions. Um, but by God, I hope that he realizes that he pushes that button and that's the end of the world. And I think he wants to go down in history as one of the Russian greats. Um, if you look at the people that are revered for one way or another in Russia, Ivan the Terrible expanded Russia. Peter the Great expanded Russia. Catherine the Great expanded Russia. Stalin expanded Russia. And I'm sure that Putin would like to go down in history as the person who expanded Russia rather than the one who destroyed the world.
Could this be seen as a play between Russia and China to destabilize the Western world economy and create a new world order with China as the dominant player and Russia as the second in command?
The meeting with leader Xi of China and Putin just before the Winter Olympics, it certainly seemed that Russia goal in that, and what they said afterwards, was for them to come closer together and thus create destabilization and of the Western system. You can't say the capitalist system because both Russia and China are quite capitalistic at the moment. But uh, whether Putin would like to have Xi in number one and Putin number two, I doubt. But I think it's been Putin's game plan right from the beginning of his, when he was prime minister, to destabilize his opponents. And he sees the West as his opponents. And if forming an alliance with China can help destabilize the West, then that is part of his goal. Becoming a junior partner in such an alliance, I think, is something his ego probably couldn't take.
Cool. And just to finish us off, what about New Zealand's role? What could, aware that New Zealand's obviously tiny, but what and could or should we be doing? And do you think the government's got it right?
Yeah, the government's walking a fine line, as most governments are at the moment, wanting to show support for Ukraine and for sovereignty um, without antagonizing either Russia or China too much. Now, we have done a few things to antagonize Russia, but in the scale of things, they're very small and unlikely to cause a missile to be dropped on Wellington. Um, so I think they're probably taking the right line. They're sending body armor and protective gear and medical gear and things like that, which is desperately needed. Um, and I think from the whole point of world peace, sending more bullets there is not the best idea in the world. So, yeah, I would say that our government got it just about right. Um, but the other thing we could, of course, do is we could, both the government and us as individuals and corporations, could be donating a lot more money to Ukraine because the humanitarian crisis there is virtually unprecedented since the Second World War. Um, and people can hardly find words to describe how bad the crisis is and what it will take to um, not overcome it. That's probably not possible, but to ameliorate it.